Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you may be, anywhere across the world. Thanks so much for joining us here live today in person for Serverless Office Hours. And we're streaming happily on the AWS Twitch channel and also on Serverless Land on YouTube. Just need to do some technical things and check, are our mics working? Please tell us in the chat if things are working, because Ben and I are in person together, which is super awesome. This is obviously none other than the amazing Ben Smith. We're on the same team. Ben, how are you today?
Yeah, good, thanks. Really hot outside in England today.
Yeah, so yeah, the thing all about climate change and all that kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. Seriously baking. Record temperatures of over 40 recorded in London. So wherever you are, stay safe, stay hydrated. We're lucky to work in a cool company where we can come into the office and take advantage of the aircon. So
it's time to come to the office today. Yeah,
I know, exactly. So maybe this is the getting back into the office thing for many people. Is when it's hot, you come and use the aircon.
Yeah.
Well, we've got lots to talk about today. Ben and I on the same team. So last time we spoke, we were also not in the same meeting room, but in a similar office talking about the really cool Lambda function URLs. So yeah, please have a look at that. But today we're going to be talking about some cool step functions kind of stuff. But while we are here, on the wrong screen, this always gets a bit complicated. Just looking back over the past week of Serverless, last week we had a super interesting show, really cool title of Infrastructure as Actual Code, with a sort of subtitle of talking about infrastructure as software. And we had the amazing Gregor Hoppe, who has done enterprise integration patterns for more than 20 years. And Luis Morales had an excellent demo showing you how you can combine your business processes with your code, in this example, using CDK to be able to deploy your applications and be able to, the whole concept was to be able to model your business in your code along with your infrastructure. So it's all mixed up, and a really clever way he was articulating how to model and how the two melding, and the infrastructure and your application doesn't have to be as separate. And obviously Serverless makes that a lot easier. So yeah, really take a look. That's on our serverlessland.com, Serverless Land YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/serverlessland. Just looking over the past week of what's new with Serverless, the big one is for AWS Lambda is Power Tools for TypeScript is now generally available. And this is super useful because it's not only for TypeScript, it's also for JavaScript. So if you're wanting to add observability and metrics and logging and tracing and some other utilities to your Lambda functions, Power Tools really is the far simpler way of being able to do that. This is code that you don't have to maintain. It's all open source. It's currently available for Java and Python, and now TypeScript/JavaScript is really available. So I'll show you, I'll give you a link to some of the blog posts, which is going to talk about that shortly. Looking back over the previous quarter, even though we are in June, in case you missed a post from Q2 2022 by our colleague Dave Boyne, has got awesome info of everything that has been released about Serverless at AWS. So that's super useful. And funnily enough, second one on the list is actually a blog post I wrote. If you've been wondering about Lambda scaling and throughput and concurrency and transactions per second and bursts and all these kind of things, I've put together a blog post to take you through it. If you've read the documentation and you were still scratching your head a bit, hopefully this is going to be a slightly different take. A few diagrams, some nice colors to help you understand. So yeah, if you are interested in Lambda and how it can scale from 0 up to crazy heights, this blog post will be your friend. And then also another interesting blog post that has come up, which is a new feature that is which is currently in preview for the Lambda console, is Amazon Code Whisperer. And Code Whisperer is machine learning for your code. Type your code in the Lambda console, and it will suggest some code snippets or things to put in your Lambda function code. And Mark's put a really good post together talking all about that, and it is actually really cool. For example, you are in Python and you start typing even your handle name of get object from S3, and it will immediately just pull up a suggestion of, oh, well, this is what your handler line will look like in Python. And then you keep typing, and it provides a whole snippet of code to say, this is exactly the code that you would use to pull from S3 for Python. Or Java, I think it's Python, Java, and Node are the languages. So yeah, super useful, just built in your console, machine learning to suggest some code kind of stuff.
On that, that blog post is about how you can use it in the console, but it's also available for your IDE as
Correct.
well.
Thank you, Ben. So within a number of different IDEs, I think it's VS Code, PyCharm, IntelliJ. There could be another one as well. These are native integrations. So yeah, super helpful, super useful to be able to see exactly what's going in. To be able to see exactly what's going on within your code. Obviously, this isn't code that is just going to write for you. You need to look at it. For example, there are some things about initiating connections to DynamoDB, for example. You probably want to put that outside your handler within your initialization code. But you know what? This machine learning is going to be getting that info for me.
It's really great for connecting different services together using the SDK. So the sort of thing where you have to Google what action you need or what kind of inputs you need for an SDK action, they're suggested for you when you use Code Whisperer. So that's what I've been using it for, is all the different SDK integration calls that you need to make.
Yeah, and exactly. And I mean, because it is also used it's grabbed from a lot of our own sort of internal, the source data for the machine learning stuff is from a whole lot of internal stuff and other Lambda functions that are being run. You know, hopefully it's going to be as accurate as, well, more accurate, I mean, probably than copying and pasting from some other random sites on their internet or some other kind of thing. So yeah, really give that a go. We are hopefully going to be having Mark on Serverless Office Hours in a few weeks' time to be able to talk all about that. So it is still AWS Summit season. All of the European summits have finished. New York Summit was last week. We had some of our colleagues there also talking about serverless espresso, so that is going to be cool. A bit of a break for a few weeks, and then Sao Paulo in Brazil. I believe Eric is possibly going to Sao Paulo. So if you are in Brazil and you are close to Sao Paulo, I've been to Sao Paulo, nice place. Please come and join us at the AWS Summit and say hi to Eric. And hear all about the cool things that Serverless is able to do for you. But today we are talking about the AWS Step Functions Workflow Collection. So Ben, obvious first sort of question, what is the Step Functions Workflow Collection?
Well, yeah, so the Step Functions Workflow Collection is a new kind of page, new interactive resource on Serverless Land. So Serverless Land is a website that was built by the DA team at AWS, the Serverless DA team specifically. And it's got some really cool stuff on here, like a collection of all the different blog posts that we write about serverless over the last 3 years. It's got a collection of all the different videos, all the different serverless office hours that we do, various events that we talk at, we upload to this as well. It's got learning paths, lots of great stuff all about serverless content from AWS. And then about a year ago, we added this thing called serverless patterns. And this is different, right? This is what we did a year ago to show sort of best practices way to connect one service to one or two other services using templating languages like SAM, CDK. Then we added Terraform and Serverless Framework recently. And I think we launched this a year ago with about 40 patterns that we contributed. And since then, the sort of wider community inside and outside of AWS have really taken and ran with this and added, hundreds of patterns that you are now able to sort of drill into and look at how, for example, you put a load balancer in front of Lambda. Here you can see the template code for that, and you can deploy that directly into your AWS account. So that's all based on connecting one service to another. That's serverless LAN patterns.
I mean, when I'm building or demoing any serverless applications, this is literally the first place I go to I was doing something recently with EventBridge and Lambda. I didn't look anywhere else. I just went straight here. I knew I wanted to do it in SAM. I knew it was going to be in I think the example I was looking at for was something was .NET. And whatever other parameters you do for the filter on the other side, there's my code, there's my pattern, simple to deploy, and you can then go and expand it into your app. So yeah, really just such a simple, useful resource.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. So what we decided to do is to kind of build off this inertia of the community generating and contributing their own patterns and finding interesting ways to connect services together. And we took that kind of framework of allowing you to browse and search and deploy and contribute, and we created something called the Serverless Workflows Collection. And this is built specifically around a really special service, my favorite service at AWS, I would say, which is called Step Functions. And Step Functions are essentially a way of building workflows on AWS which allow you to orchestrate other services where the output of one step is passed on to the input, becomes the input of the next step. So you're able to build very complex, very scalable, very visual workflows to do pretty much anything you can think of on AWS, and even reach beyond AWS into third-party SaaS applications and your own on-premise applications. So all that to say is that since the launch of Step Functions a few years ago, there's been so much progress in features and what step functions is able to do, things like express and standard workflows, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute, and so many different ways that we're seeing customers use step functions to create really interesting applications. We wanted to put all of this into one place on serverless land to kind of spark ideas and best practices for other users to see how they can use step functions themselves. So that's how this workflows collection was born. And it looks a bit similar to the patterns collection. What you're able to do in here is you're able to come in and browse by use case or browse by a service. And you can see very visually, very obviously, what each step function workflow is doing just by reading the different steps. The images actually have icons of the service integration that it's using. So for example, this one is called, let's look at like a really simple one. And we'll go through how we've labeled them as well. I think it might be useful. What's a very small one? Smart cron job. So this is cool. This is being contributed by, I think, an SA at AWS. So it's not actually by someone on the team. It's a really cool workflow, very simple, that just allows you to wait until a certain timestamp before you execute another workflow. And you can see that it's built using service integration. So there's no Lambda code, there's no sort of EC2 code directly being used here. It's just using native step function integrations to call other services in the workflow.
Ben, just before you carry on, you've often used the term with me of sort of step functions for everything.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Step functions first, step functions always.
There we go. Step functions first, step functions always. Yeah.
Because step functions is super scalable, right? And it's very visual. So if you're a builder that likes to quickly mock things up with this drag and drop interface that you have with step functions, where you can add built-in catch and retries for sort of error handling, you can look at each individual execution and drill down and see why things failed by using the console interface. And then you can take the definition of your workflow and continue building locally with things like SAM and CDK. So for me, it has everything you need to build an application. And one of the challenges that still remains, I think, with serverless applications, because it's all distributed and it's all kind of stateless, is it's very difficult to conceptualize what your application looks like, where the different pieces are and how they interact with each other.
So this is sort of taking some of that, it's not necessarily complexity, but some of the stuff that's already in your code, taking it out of your code, so it's code that you don't have to maintain, and you can visually look at it in the console, which is super useful.
Exactly. Like, I mean, imagine sitting with a stakeholder and mocking up together with a drag and drop interface what your application will do, more or less, and then you can agree on that's the flow of the kind of workload through your application, and then you can take that away and start building it locally. So you've mocked it up, you can then continue developing locally. So there's so many reasons why I think every application can be written in step functions.
Or should at least consider it. And I think it's also a natural progression of what was the power of Lambda. The power of Lambda was being able to remove that undifferentiated heavy lifting of looking after infrastructure and multi-AZ and giving you that agility to build your applications. Well, now this is another level of abstraction that you can use step functions to remove a whole bunch of code out of your Lambda function that may have been doing application level retries or things like that. Ben, I know you're going to show some kind of things. I just want to quickly do some comments and questions while we're in. Of course, EDJ Greek, Eric, yeah, you're all in the same room. So jealous. Well, you're with us in spirit, Eric. So
I was with Eric last week.
There we go. You were.
Yeah, we've had enough of each other, Eric. Come on. Give it a rest.
There was also another comment about sort of looking at some of the different patterns, which we may get onto as well. Yes, Eric, we're always with you in spirit. We're not necessarily going to be able to go through a whole bunch of patterns, but yeah, Cloud Surfer 22, we're going to post the links. Well, first of all, thanks for joining us from YouTube. We are going to post the links. You are looking for particular patterns. I'm sure many people are going to be looking at particular patterns. So once I do have a chance, I will in the chat post some of the links so you can have a look at to explore. But yeah, just looking payloads above 256K, you want to be sticking something in S3 and just looking at a reference. I'm not quite sure if we've got a step functions pattern for that, but I think there is one already in the other server serverless patterns
Yeah, maybe
connection as well.
I don't think we have a step functions
Yeah.
workflow for that, but there will almost definitely be a pattern
Yeah.
that can help.
I'm pretty sure I've used that as well. And Cloud Server, another useful pattern, how to use Saga to handle XA transactions using Lambda and RDS. So Saga patterns and step functions is also a match made in heaven.
Yeah, so should we have a little look at what we have in here and how you can use it? So this is broken down into 3 different levels, or 3 different levels of complexity, maybe is one way of looking at it, where you have something called a fundamental workflow, a pattern, and an application. So fundamental is just a very simple building block for your step functions workflow.
So fundamental things, you would then use multiple fundamental things maybe to build an application.
Yes, you'd use multiple of these to create a pattern. You'd use multiple patterns to create a microservice.
Okay, so there's sort of a progression in terms of complexity and what you'd use them for. Okay,
like for example, this one here, wait for callback, is a really common thing that you'll use with step functions, where you can fire an asynchronous workload off, fire and forget, and you can do that in step functions, and you can branch differently or fan out differently based on that initial invocation. So you have your fundamentals, then you have your patterns. So patterns are slightly more complex. These are common things that you'll see repeated in multiple different types of applications, not just in workflows, not just in serverless, just different patterns like the Saga pattern, like the circuit breaker, that you'll see people using just to build applications in general. And the point of putting that in here is to show that so many of these sort of computer science patterns or application building patterns can be implemented using step functions workflows, and can be even improved by implementing them using step functions workflow.
And also, the term pattern is, even talking from last week with Gregor Hoppe, 20 years ago, he wrote this book, Enterprise Integration Patterns. And I think even terms like circuit breaker and can't think of many of them. He literally created and defined these terms, and Gregor himself was saying how flexible serverless is able to create and use these kind of patterns. So these are patterns that we are making up willy-nilly. These are patterns that have been documented for more than 20 years, and now because of a serverless service like step functions, you can really build them in a low or less code way,
and quickly.
So and visually.
There's a comment here. Can I show you this comment? Love the cloud formation deploy button on each pattern. Yes, this is something really unique and totally reduces any friction for people that are new to step functions or AWS in general. I should say, personally, this is my belief. I think step functions is the easiest way to build an application on AWS, simply because of this sort of familiar drag and drop interface that you can then download and continue building offline, right? And what we've done by creating this one-click deploy button is to make that even easier. So I want to show you that in a minute, but before we get to that, I want to show you how we've laid out a pattern. So or a workflow rather. So once you choose a workflow that you want to deploy, so let's have a look at this one, Event Bridge Replay Events. You can click into it, and there you can see a kind of description of what quickly,
Ben, Zach Jones Noel, thanks so much for joining us. I'm just going to remove the comments so we can just get the whole screen. But Zach Jones Noel, we love you. Thanks for joining us again.
So once you clicked in, you can view in a sort of slightly larger format what that workflow does, and you can kind of reason about by looking at how it's built and what the comments are. Then you can click into the template button, and whether the workflow is being built using CDK or SAM, different templating languages that you might use, you can understand how it's been put together, right? And this is really useful when you start building, or when you're already quite advanced at building any kind of serverless application. I think you'll probably be Googling different ways to define different resources, right? And you'll be in the documentation, you'll be trying to do something that maybe isn't in the documentation specifically. So you'll go to Google. Hopefully this is a place that will pop up in those Google search results, because these are real projects that people are building and sharing using step functions, right?
Well, if you're even building things, just go straight here.
Even better, right? Even better.
When you're in the know.
So you can see how those different resources are defined, the different resources that comprise your workflow. And then the final thing you can do is you can look at what's called the workflow definition. Now, this is the ASL, the Amazon States Language definition of your workflow. And this is a language that is specifically being created to define workflows in AWS. It's basically JSON with some special reserved words and layouts to be able to build workflows. But it looks very much like JSON, and it uses something very similar to JSON path in order to kind of access different objects in your workflow payload.
Ben, while you're on with that, CloudSurfer again, thanks for the good questions. Good ones today. When you use CloudFormation, do you deploy ASL or build out the workflow entirely with CloudFormation?
Do you deploy ASL or build out the workflow? Okay, so when you use CloudFormation, you can do either, I think.
I think maybe just to start from the beginning, CloudFormation is deploying the resources, and then ASL is the language to describe the state machine. And the state machine is a resource. So in a way, you deploy your state machine with CloudFormation and then use the ASL, which defines the resource. So in a way, you don't actually define the resource in CloudFormation. CloudFormation uses the ASL text to create the.
But you can.
But you can.
You can define it without any still with ASL, but without a separate ASL.
It doesn't have to be. You can, as like with the Lambda function, you can embed the code within CloudFormation. Right, yeah. This is embedding the ASL text within CloudFormation, but it's not actually native CloudFormation. You just you model your step functions in ASL, and you can either in CloudFormation import a file, or you can include it within your template.
This is how I suggest is the best way to do it, right? If you're using SAM, which is an abstraction of CloudFormation, is to define your workflow. Where's the workflow here? So this is the workflow defined in SAM with type serverless. Then you see this definition URI. So this points to where the actual ASL file is that defines everything else within the workflow, not just the name of the workflow and the role that it's going to use, but the actual steps that the workflow takes. Then you use this thing called a definition substitution, which passes information from your SAM template to your ASL file, things like Lambda function ARNs or event bus names in this case, right? So this is my where I'm defining kind of high-level stuff of my workflow. And then in my workflow definition, here is where I'm bringing in that Lambda function ARN as a definition substitution. And this keeps those two, my templating language and my workflow definition nicely decoupled and separate, which I think is what you want when you start building this locally and you have your CI/CD pipeline. So what we did, you can't deploy usually from a SAM template directly into the console with a single click button. I don't think it's possible. So some clever guy on our team called David helped to create a script which uses the SAM package CLI and some other steps to generate this SAM template into pure CloudFormation. It saves it on as a public S3 object, which this button then points you. And what that means is when you hit that button, you can now deploy this workflow directly into your AWS account just by clicking through a few different options here, right? So I can just name my workflow. And these are all parameters that this is a parameter that's added to that SAM template, right? And then when I'm happy with all the different options here, I think I have to just acknowledge and tick this. And there you go. This will now create my stack. Here you can see it getting built in CloudFormation. And after a few minutes, when that's built, I'll be able to go directly into that workflow and start using it. So there's really no barrier to entry to trying out these different workflows from the workflow collection.
So this is one click.
One click. Well, one click and then a few more clicks.
Yeah, one click and some validation of input. But if there's not much to validate, you'd be pretty quick.
Yeah, and that's what I love about what we've created here is that you are able to kind of throw up a workflow into your account, try it out, extend it, see if it fits your purpose, understand how it's built, if that's the thing that you're looking for, and then just tear it back down again. That will be built in a sec. If I click through here, there we go. There's a couple more things to do. That one didn't deploy. Something wrong with that. Oh, it looks like this object in particular has not been made
publicly available.
Yeah, okay. So I chose one which is
V1.
Great.
Sod's law, yeah.
Yeah. That's what happens when you and I.
Yeah, as you can see, we are live. So
Yeah.
you can see some of the questions have already been coming in. If you do have any other questions for Ben or about anything service in general, please send them on. Please, via the chat.
Let's try another one. Maybe this is a real
issue.
Yeah, maybe. Let's have a little look. This one is called what's this one? A loop, isn't it? Let me just go back. Pagination loop. So this is showing a pattern where if you have multiple results and you want to do some kind of process on each result in your step, then you have to kind of page through each of those results. Then you're able to check if there's still a next page. And if there is, you go to the next page. And if not, then you exit the workflow. So this is just a simple implementation of that pattern, right? This should deploy. Not that it matters for this particular talk, but I like to see things through.
Yeah.
So that's how you use the kind of workflows collection. But the other really important part of this is contributing to it, right? Being part of the community, sharing the workflows that you've built and kind of sharing ideas with people. So that's something I wanted to quickly just briefly show you how you can do, right? Every single workflow that is added to the collection has its own GitHub repository where you can drill down to find out more information about what that workflow does. And that link is on the bottom of the page down here. And here's all the different resources that comprise that workflow, a bit more information about how it works and what it does. And here is where I can submit a pull request to add my own workflow to the collection. It's all done via GitHub, right? So if I go back to the top of this repository and I scroll down to this, I think it's publishing.md, this tells me exactly all the information that you need to know about how you contribute to the workflows collection. Essentially, you do a fork of this GitHub repository, follow these steps, upload the directory with all your workflow resources, and then when you're happy that your workflow is uploaded, you've done things like add an image with your workflow, you've added the ASL, you've added the SAM or the CDK template, then you just make a pull request on this repository, right? Make a pull request using a Git command. And if you're really helping us out, then you'll also create an issue as well. And in the issue here, I think there's actually a template that you can use. You can use this issue template to tell us a little bit more information about your workflow, and that will help us kind of move it through the publishing pipeline.
I'd suggest people do the issue because it's much easier to create. Anyone who's worked on open source projects making sure the things in the right format and all the files are there and the attribution is all there is important.
Yeah, that's how you contribute. That's how we already have, I think, 10 contributions since we launched it a few days ago. Maybe it was about 10 days ago. So that's a really important part of this whole collection, is that we want people to be able to contribute in on that, don't we? What else is useful to know about the workflows collection?
Well, that's from the workflows connection. I just want to grab a question which from Alpa Codes. Thanks for joining us again. Yeah, how often do you see yourself manually editing the ASL files? Obviously working with the Workflow Studio, which is the visual editor, and then including the resulting file in SAM, CloudFormation Infrastructure as Code, a good long-term strategy?
I think that's the best strategy for the moment. So I know there's work going on within the product team to make this much more kind of seamless workflow where you can do both locally or in the console. But at the moment, I think that is the best strategy, to quickly mock up your workflow in the console with that nice drag and drop interface and configuration, and then export the ASL definition locally to a local file and continue there. And then if you need kind of big changes that might take longer to do in the local ASL file, I would normally go back to the console and mock them up, and then you have to replace your definition substitutions when you bring it locally.
Yeah, so is that more the more slightly onerous part is those substitutions?
That's the bit you lose when you go between the two.
Makes sense.
But even better, like how you could improve this workflow or keep this workflow but make it as seamless as possible is to use something like SAM Accelerate, right? So you grab your definition substitution, then you're coding locally, and you set up SAM Accelerate so that it's able to watch your ASL file. SAM Accelerate is a command line tool or a sort of an extra feature of the SAM command line, which allows you to synchronize your local stack with the development version of your stack in your AWS account. And what it does is it looks for the different code files, things like Lambda source code, API gateway definitions, and step functions ASL files. And every time you make a change to one of those pieces of code, it uses the API action to directly upload that into your account. So it's like, it's as close as we have, I think, to coding locally, but it, instantly updating your cloud environment within a couple of seconds.
Yeah, as soon as you hit save on that, it's not doing a whole CloudFormation deploy.
Right.
It's literally hitting Lambda step functions or API gateway API just with a code update.
That's the key. It's not doing the deploy just for editing code or saving code. Yeah. So it's a much quicker way of checking as you develop. Yeah.
I can't believe Eric called this out as well. The workflows connection. Eric, didn't you get a T-shirt? They're in grey. We're wearing them today. That's the fashion statement of the day. Interestingly, but yeah, maybe we're not going to take super good fashion advice from us as well. Cloud Surfer again, thanks for your question. Some of the limits for state machines workflows, trying to see if there are limits like Lambda thresholds, max concurrency as well. Ben, I do want you to cover that, but also I think it would be useful also to then look at some of the things you can do with step functions. That's what I'm sort of gathering from people are interested in, is what are the kind of things you can do for step functions, and then maybe we can cover maybe just some of the basics, even standard and express workflows and some of the limits, and what you can and can't do.
What you can and can't do. Well, this is what I was saying earlier, right? Step functions first, step functions always. That I would say there's not an awful lot that you can't do. The one interesting thing that starts to happen when you're building a really big application with step functions, though, and this is why it might not always be the best choice, is that you're essentially creating, in a way, like your own monolith, right? Because everything is contained within that workflow. Sure, it might connect to other services, it might call out to other services, but we're kind of going back, in a sense, to a way of building one big application within a workflow. And if you want to keep things decoupled and you need kind of messaging between different microservices, then that's a slightly different model, right? So that's always one area where I say to people to kind of be careful. If you don't want to create that kind of an application, then you don't want to accidentally build that, right?
So what are things people can and builders can keep in the back of their mind while they are building their workflows? Because obviously, even just grabbing any workflow, if somebody is starting from a fundamental going into a pattern and then building an application, by nature that's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So can you then split up your step functions into separate step functions that call each other, nested there? I know step functions can do nested things and express workflows and everything. Maybe just give a bit of an overall picture of how to construct your step functions application.
Sure, but the first thing you need is to have an idea of what you want to build. It would be very difficult to go to the workflows collection and look at some fundamentals and start building something without already having something in mind, right? So that's probably the first step, is have an application that you want to build, and then you can almost certainly build that using step functions, right? So that's the first thing to know.
So was this part of what you were saying earlier about taking that business domain knowledge, and because it is step functions is so visual, I know on the example here, we've got something that's sort of quite particular to step functions, but if we were to pick on an application and we wanted to do a moderate catalog, just looking at that, if somebody came to you with a business problem and we need to do a moderation catalog, what do we need to do? We need to check for inappropriate content. If there is inappropriate content, we want to notify someone, detecting objects in an image, detecting text, recording some of that data in a database. That looks very much like a business workflow that, as you were saying, you can work with your business development people, and then you as an IT builder can build this in step functions and sort of go back to that.
So there's a few areas where step functions really shines out as an obvious choice, okay? The first one, especially when you're building with serverless applications, where typically if you're building a synchronous application, you don't want to have something running continuously because
you're waiting for nothing.
For that, right? With step functions, it's different, okay? So with step functions, you can fire off an action and you can use something called a task token. And what that means is your step function workflow will, once it's done that thing that action does, it will stop at that step. and it will emit this task token, and you might store that in a database or send that off via an email or do something with that task token. And it will wait in that state until it receives a command to continue along with that same task token, so it knows it's from the correct execution.
So that can be used for any bunch of things, either an automated process or human approval. It's basically a pause in the middle of the step functions.
Yes.
And remind us how long the step functions can run for?
So a standard workflow can run for 1 year, waiting for you to send back that task token. And you can have multiple of these task token emissions, these pauses. So anything where you have a kind of like a conveyor belt process where you need some interaction, maybe a human approval step like this example here, where we're detecting something in an image, it's great because you don't pay for that wait time, right? You only pay for the transitions of your workflow. The different step transitions is the payment model, essentially. So you don't pay for wait time. It's a great way of building applications that can span over a long kind of workflow, something that might take a long time to complete from start to finish, where there's obviously lots of steps involved. You can visually see the steps. You can build in these sort of approval wait gates, if you like. This is where step functions really starts to shine. This is one of the best use cases of it, is something that needs a human approval process, but still needs to be serverless.
And I suppose it may not necessarily be a human approval process, which is important, but it could be a third-party system or something on premises, or something anywhere that's completely out of AWS, some process needs to go and gather something, do something, and eventually come back into AWS to say, oh, this is now finished and the step functions can continue.
I mean, it will almost certainly be something where it has to reach outside, even if it's just an email saying, click here to approve and here to deny. So you can use that task token to send back into the system along with the yes or the no action that you've clicked on. And then your workflow can resume and branch according to what you inputted it, right? So the next thing where it really shines is the concurrency, or the sort of the way that you're able to run multiple workflows concurrently.
Okay.
And the way you can scale that out using workflows is really interesting. And there's actually a great blog post that I wanted to show people here. This is by our director of step functions. I mean, I think it's awesome that he's using the service all the time.
Writing blog posts
and
about
writing
it,
blog posts. Yeah. So this is a really interesting blog post that shows you how to control concurrency in your applications using step functions, and it goes really deep into how, in this particular example, a workflow which would run sequentially would take 4 hours, when scaled out and run concurrently using step functions would take just 60 seconds. And you can actually deploy this application and play around with it for yourself. You pasted the link in there. Perfect. So this is another great reason to use step functions.
So basically, very high throughput parallel processing.
Yes. And one of the reasons it's able to do that is because you're able to trigger a workflow from a workflow. Right?
A nested workflow.
Exactly. And when you do that, in fact, let's have a little look at the step functions console here, because it's got a nice comparison between Express and Standard, which I think is worth talking about, right? When you create a workflow in the console, you'll get this option asking you if you want to create something called a standard workflow or an express workflow. And then you can click on this drop down which says help me decide. So we mentioned earlier that standard workflows run for up to 1 year, which is pretty incredible. Now, express workflows can only run for 5 minutes, right? But they can be synchronous. So what that means is, because it's a shorter duration, is you can trigger an express workflow via something like an API gateway call, and you can have API gateway hang around for up to 29 seconds, I think it is, to receive the response from your step functions workflow. So you can trigger a workflow, run a bunch of actions, orchestrate a bunch of services, and hang around for the response, all within a few seconds, right? Because the transition speed with express workflows is incredibly fast, like even compared to standard workflows. It's a completely different execution model in that sense. It's also a lot more cost effective. The payment is listed here, but
it's a lot of zeros.
It's a big difference, yeah. Now, what you lose, or what you kind of I guess what you lose in when you use Express versus Standard is you only have 5 minutes of execution time, and you have a different way of monitoring your execution history. You can't kind of step through your workflow execution history in the same way.
Because there couldn't be hundreds of thousands of them.
Yes,
Yeah.
it still saves your execution history, but it's in CloudWatch logs, so it's just a different way of checking it out. But what that means is you can start a standard workflow that has a long running process. Maybe it takes a few weeks or a few months or a few hours to complete, but there might be sub processes within that workflow that don't take very long, which you can run using an express workflow. And by combining these two workflow types, decoupling your application or sort of changing your application into smaller and smaller problems, right? By using workflows that do very specific things, you can have this incredible scale and concurrency. And this is where the argument that step functions is difficult to price or is not very cost effective. This is where that argument falls down, because once you learn how to implement a standard workflow and an express workflow correctly and together, you can really make some powerful patterns and some really cost effective ways of operating at scale as well.
So you can use your standard workflow for the sort of the big overarching organization of your workflow.
Yeah.
And maybe you are pulling records from a database, for example, and then you want to iterate over every record in that database, and whether that's send an email out or push notification or do something. If you get 10,000 requests or 100,000 requests or 100,000 records from this database, you can then fan out and use an express workflow to run a separate workflow on each record within that you've received from the primary database and do X. And that's going to run in parallel. It's going to be super fast, super efficient, and much cheaper.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. Should we answer some questions? I
can see certainly. Well, yeah, Cloud Surfer, thanks again. Also about the task tokens, which you're talking about. Does the task token have info in which state and a workflow to resume?
No, it's just a long
UUID. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
The thing is, it doesn't actually need to have the info. I don't know if you're asking it from the thing of when you look at the task token, can you as the reader see which workflow to resume? You don't need to, because it's a UUID which is specific to that task, and Step Functions maintains the history of that task and how that works.
I think they want a way of knowing. The next question here, look, is there a script to find which workflows are waiting on callbacks? Will help if I had quite a few state machines created. Yes, I think there is. So every state machine execution always has the status of that current workflow. So whether that's completed, failed, pending, I'm sure there's some others. So I think you can use the list executions SDK action, and on that list executions SDK action, you can add a parameter for the status, and I think that's how you get what you're looking for here.
Yeah, just back onto that previous question about the task token. I don't think you personally have to know, as Ben's good example of the email with a yes or no to approve or deny something. That task token would just be buried in that email. It's a long string. You would then click on a link which would kick off an SDK action, and that just calls Step Functions with this link, and Step Functions goes, I know exactly which state machine, exactly which workflow to resume, and off it goes.
Another good question here about choreography.
Oh yes, Alpha codes. Yeah, that was a good one.
To read that out.
Yeah, so what are some of the factors you're looking at when choosing between Step Functions and Event Bridge? And some people do talk about Step Functions being an orchestration platform, and an Event Bridge being a choreography platform. So Ben, what do you think?
So we might answer this differently perhaps, but this is how I think of it, is that you use Step Functions or orchestration to organize the interaction within a microservice, so within a certain bounds of your service or your application, and you use choreography to communicate across or between those different microservices. So that way they can stay nicely sort of decoupled from each other within the bounds of what that service or what that microservice should be doing. That's how I think of it.
Yep, I certainly wouldn't disagree with that at all. I think that's perfect. I think it alludes to what you were saying earlier about creating these monolith step functions when they can get bigger and bigger and bigger. What do we do when things get bigger and bigger and bigger? They are difficult to reason about, difficult to test, and difficult to deploy. So you get to some stage when you want to break things up, and that possibly means you're going to break them into separate microservices. So I would think your step functions should never split across microservices, and if your microservices get big enough, you want to have separate ones. So each microservice could have its own step functions as well, and then as a step function finishes or completes or gets to a certain stage, that can emit an event. So the step functions can emit an event onto EventBridge via the SDK integrations. And actually, we should cover that the SDK integrations specifically, just in case people aren't aware. And then the step functions in the separate microservice can then start and do whatever it needs to do. And in fact, any other servers can also listen to what's going on that event bus and react to those.
There's another question here.
So yeah, let's just before Kevin, we talk about the recovering with errors, just about the SDK integrations. If people don't know, tell us about that, Ben.
I'll show you, because I think it's a visual service.
Honestly, this is one of probably the most powerful things I think anything in AWS has created. And I'm not one for being overly talking about things, but yeah, this blows my mind whenever I use it.
So before this thing called SDK integrations or universal service integrations, another term that people use, when you build your step functions workflow, I think it had about 13 different tasks that your step can integrate with, different services that your step can integrate with, things like running a Lambda function. Trying to remember what some of the original tasks were.
Calling an API.
Calling an API was one, yeah.
Well, other step functions. There was certain, I think the glue jobs was part of that. You could do the jobs.
So what that meant was if you wanted to orchestrate services together that wasn't one of those 13, what you were typically doing was adding a Lambda function, and you were writing some SDK actions in your Lambda function to communicate to those other services. This is how we built Serverless Espresso at the beginning of around this time last year, because they hadn't launched the SDK integrations yet. So we had these big workflows that were using lots of Lambda functions to then call out to other services.
Even simple things like reading from DynamoDB, writing a single JSON object to DynamoDB, something really quite simple, whole Lambda function you need to run and maintain.
Now, I think it was around the autumn of last year, right? Before reInvent, the step function team launched this thing called serverless integrations, service integrations, which allow you to directly call over 9,000 SDK actions from your workflow directly. And
so anything in the AWS SDK that you can do natively in step functions without a Lambda function required.
So it looks like this. Here's the Workflow Studio console. Let's say I want to grab something from a DynamoDB database. Well, I search for it here. I can see my get item. And then on the right-hand side, this form allows me to configure how that looks. Now, this was actually one that did exist before. So let's look for a different one, like a put item, right? Item. Like that existed before as well. What didn't exist? S3 something or other. See how I'm able to easily search
Create a bucket in S3, for example.
Let's delete a bucket analytics configuration, right? So it has in here the actual parameters that API needs in order to do that action, right? And I can just configure that directly within the form. And I can search for all of my different SDK integrations directly from,
or even ECS task, for instance, right at the top there. That so I mean, this isn't, even when we're talking about DynamoDB and S3 is very serverless services, but this is any API call. This is, it doesn't have to be anything to do with serverless. Even things when you want to find things about EC2, or even this, this is an ECS run task on Fargate. There you go. All you need is the launch type, the cluster, and the task definition, and you're going to be able to pull info about your ECS tasks.
So coming back to our Serverless Espresso story, what we did, we rebuilt Serverless Espresso at the beginning of this year. We stripped out all but one of those Lambda tasks. We still needed a Lambda function to do some compute and some transform. It was a really good use case for Lambda. Everything else that we had Lambda doing was kind of passing some information from one service to another, right? We stripped that out and we replaced it with a direct integration using these SDK actions. And you can actually build that for yourself using the Serverless Espresso workshop.
I'm just wondering if this order processor workflow is...
looks like an older version of it.
I know, I'm just trying to see whether it is...
Yeah, might be. Have a look.
Possibly.
If you go to edit, look.
And the Workflow Studio, and then it's there.
This is not the exact one that runs Serverless Espresso, but it's pretty similar. So here you can see just from the icons here, there's no Lambda involved, right? There's not a single Lambda function in this main workflow that controls each order of Serverless Espresso. If you don't know what Serverless Espresso is, where have you been? You've been talking about that a lot, right? But it's a demo that we made for ordering a cup of coffee using entirely serverless services. So it's like a pop-up coffee stand that we we run at different AWS summits.
But the interesting thing here, just you can see, getting information from DynamoDB and the choice state. But look at this, some of the interesting things you can do here as well. Within the step functions, back to the previous comment about when to use step functions in EventBridge, better together is super awesome as well. Here is just as part of the step functions workflow, thought it would be interesting to emit an event to say that this particular workflow is started, and that means that some other service can react to that, and then the step functions workflow is going to continue. But at times within your step functions workflow, it could be useful to let other services know what things are happening.
Actually, here's a good example of where we pause. So what this does is it puts an event onto EventBridge and it emits that task token onto EventBridge, and then it pauses. This is where it waits for the user to choose their order on their phone. And when they choose their order on their phone, that sends an API call back into the workflow along with that task token, and it resumes it and goes ahead and generates the number. So that's how we're using that exact pattern on Serverless Espresso. There's some really good questions in the chat that we.
Well, should we just do the? Let's just Cloud Surfer again. Thanks. Does the studio tell what IAM permissions to create for the workflow?
Yes, it does. I think some of these permissions it will ask if you want it to create for you when you first create the workflow, right? And it will check with you and it will go and do that. But I don't think it's every permission, and it's only when you first create it. After that, if you add new actions when you edit the workflow, I think it does tell you that your workflow is missing certain permissions, and then you have to go back into IAM and apply those permissions. Okay. So it definitely helps you to figure out what those permissions are.
And because it's really bounded, it's not a Lambda function doing a whole bunch of stuff. You can see it visually and you go, this generate order number. You know specifically what the API, that's an optimized one, but you know the API. If this was an API call to put item to DynamoDB, you know it's going to be put item permissions. You're going to have the table name, and it's actually probably going to make it a little bit easier to at least work out what permissions you're going to need. We've been dying to get onto Kevin's question. Kevin, thanks for joining us via YouTube. Can you talk about recovering from errors and potentially resuming retrying a step in a workflow?
Yes. So something that AWS is really good at is listening to what customers want, right? And acting on that. This is something that lots of people have asked for, right? It's a really, really useful thing to be able to do is when you have an error in your workflow, you might be able to remedy that error just by resuming it with a different payload, correcting the payload or something like that, right? So this is something, Kevin, that lots of people have asked for. AWS are really good at actioning those kind of requests. So please, I'll take that question if that's something you need back to the product team for you, and let's see if they're working on something like that. I think it would be a great addition to step functions for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the first part of it you can do today about recovering from errors, because step functions you can, it depends what that error is. If you reading something from RDS or writing something to DynamoDB, you can have error logic that is built within in your state machine. And also any of these SDK integrations, there we go, which Ben is showing, a lot of that error handling is built in natively. So that's also super useful to use these SDK integrations, because if step functions for some reason isn't able to emit something to EventBridge, it's going to retry that on your behalf, or you can decide what you're going to do. Here you can see the fallback state, for example. So there is already a lot of error handling that this enables.
Yeah, so the slightly different thing though. So what you're talking about there is building in ways to kind of try and catch and handle errors within your workflow, which is super useful and a brilliant way of like visualizing what happened when when things went down a different path. I think what Kevin's asking for is the other side of that, when there's an error that you haven't caught, but you want to kind of replay from there.
So head back up another chain of your step functions, or replay part of it, or do all that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's
no, definitely. And in fact, Kevin, would be super keen to find out your experiences and the exact kind of thing you're looking for, because we know the step functions team are doing a lot of research on this as well. Also talking about how you can do testing in step functions, how you can mock things in various stages. That's also going to be interesting to look at. So first part, I know you were talking about the recovering from errors within the state machine, but just for people who aren't aware, within the SDK integrations, there is a lot of error handling already built in. I think we're good on the questions for now, unless I've missed something, Ben. No,
I think that's it.
Yeah, any other questions, please please send them on. So yeah, just as sort of wrapping up as our time is coming, what sort of just even quickly looking at some of the patterns, which are the ones that you know and you like, and you would think if people are wanting to learn about step functions, this is a good way to get going, to find out what's possible.
So I think one that we implemented on Serverless Espresso is a really good one, a really powerful pattern. It's called the emit and wait. Let's see if I can find it here. This one, emit and wait workflow. So this is what, one of the great ways to use step functions that we spoke about earlier is where you can run a step, wait for, emit that task token and wait for that human approval process back. So this pattern is just purely showing you how to do that. So that's a great one, a great use case for step functions. Good one to start with. Other patterns I like, human in the loop, that's similar. This one's really good. Where is it? It's the API one. Wait for callback, synchronous API. So this is a slightly different way of using step functions, right? Imagine that you have an API gateway inbound request that goes directly to a step functions workflow, and then based on the path of that request, based on the method put, post, patch, get, based on different parts of what that request has, you branch in different ways on your express workflow and return your response. So here you're basically building a REST API that routes everything to step functions, and step functions handles the routing logic for you because it's all visual, right? So I think that's a really interesting way of using workflows. Yeah.
Super interesting. Well, Ben, thank you so much. I think there is so much to have a look about over here. Even I know there's some sort of patterns with Saga, because that's a very common use case. If you're using Saga patterns with step functions, they're going to be many, and there are going to be many more patterns added over here. And if you've got some great ideas, as Ben says, this is all open source. We would absolutely love to hear your feedback. And yeah, Cloud Surfer 22, thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate the
questions.
Yeah, appreciate the kind words. If I had a virtual high five or a virtual sticker I could hand you through the screen, you'd certainly get it today for your awesome questions. So Ben, yeah, first of all, thanks so much for chatting us today. You are one of our gurus on step functions, so we really appreciate you taking us through it and showing what's possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So yeah, just looking, this is obviously the link to the workflows collection. So if you, I did post it in the chat, but s12d.com/workflows, that's going to be useful. And as Ben talked about earlier, this did start a year ago with the serverless patterns collection. I can see when I did the screenshot, it was 310, it's now 317. Every week they're getting more and more workflow patterns. So that's also super useful for any infrastructure as code, many infrastructure as code tools to connect things together. And of course, everything serverless on serverlessland.com. So these are the patterns, the workflows, as Ben said, videos, learning paths, blogs, information on serverless office hours as well. We hopefully next week we've got a super cool release that is coming up. I was hoping that it was going to be released in this hour. I could see my Chime chat numbers have been going up, so maybe that is ready. So I can't tell you quite yet, but it's a super cool new release that's going to be very useful and very helpful to be able to scale permissions for one of our services, which is the teaser I'm going to give you. But thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back same time, same place next week for serverless office hours. Enjoy the rest of your week. And if you're in the UK or in a whole bunch of places in Europe and it's super hot, stay hydrated, and why don't you stay in your cold, wherever you are cold, in your air conditioning or at home, and try out some serverless patterns. Thank you very much.